Greetings and salutations. This is Unai Montes-Irueste. Had the opportunity today to, on the second day of the Voice Your Vote college campus tour that Politic365 is doing. As part of this, we're not just going to college campuses. It's really sort of it's more of like an engagement, education, and mobilization efforts that Politic365 and its partners are leading around the conventions, the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention. One of the more important organizations for both sides of the aisle, for both Democrats and Republicans, is the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, aka NALEO. And NALEO had a conference a few months ago, and both President Barack Obama and Republican nominee for the presidency, former governor of Massachusetts, Mitt Romney, went to speak to NALEO's membership. NALEO represents, I believe it's over 6,000 Latino elected officials, Hispanic elected officials, all across the United States. NALEO is a nonpartisan organization. It has Republican, Democratic, Independent, and other members, Greens, etc., Libertarians. But it essentially is an organization that sees as its mission the engagement and the activation and the involvement of Latinos, of Hispanics in all aspects of American political life, especially serving as members of elected office. So, with that said, I had the opportunity to speak to the vice president of NALEO's board of directors, Luz Weinberg, who is a city commissioner here in Florida, in the city of Aventura, here in Florida. She is a Puerto Rican woman who is really, a great vice president of NALEO in terms of being very energetic, being very involved, being very devoted, and being very committed to the mission of NALEO. She is very proud to talk about NALEO's mentorship program. So they, have worked very hard to try to bring, as I mentioned before, more Latinos into elected office and appointed office, but they also want to make sure that when Hispanics are in elected office, when they're in appointed office, that they're able to be successful. So they've created a mentorship structure for both of those goals, for getting elected, getting appointed, and then also once you're in service, being able to have the impact and the effect that you want to have. We talked about this effort. We talked a lot about what has happened in terms of NALEO's involvement with voters in a new landscape that is populated by changes to early voting and third-party voter registration. NALEO has been involved since 2006 in a coalition called Ya Es Hora. And Ya Es Hora has worked with major networks like Univision and has worked all across different organizations to try to engage folks who are permanent residents, who are eligible for citizenship, to begin that process and successfully navigate that process, and then upon completion of that process, register as voters. So from permanent residents to citizens to active engaged citizens who are voters. But in addition, they've also done general voter registration all across the country. And one of the challenges of doing, voter registration, voter education, voter mobilization as a nonprofit organization, as a nonpartisan organization, is obviously, it's hard to get funds for that. You'd be surprised how little interest there is out there, as somebody who's worked in a number of nonprofits that have tried to, without having a specific candidate or campaign, mobilize around the engagement and registration of especially young voters and voters of color. And unfortunately, a lot of people have failed, but Ya Es Hora is succeeding and continuing to succeed. So Luz Weinberg and I spoke about voter registration and how much of an impact that had in the last election cycle, the presidential election cycle, but also in the 2010 election cycle. Interesting fun fact about Latino voters in 2010, In places where they were engaged and involved, they actually overperformed. So as a general rule, there are fewer voters that show up and actually vote either by mail or on election day in what are called midterm years, the elections that happen between presidential elections. So in 2010, that was not an exception. There were fewer people that voted in 2010 than voted in 2008. But in states like the state of Nevada, for instance, Latinos only comprise 12% of all registered voters in the state of Nevada. But on election day in 2010, the total percentage of people who were Latino who voted was 16%. So 12% of the entire population of voters are Latino, but of all of the ones that participated in 2010, 16%. And that made a huge impact. It helped Harry Reid keep his Senate seat. As I mentioned, also it was a chunk of what helped Brian Sandoval and others, really assert their leadership in that state. So it's an interesting phenomenon to see, how Latinos are being engaged, who's engaging them, and how much political muscle Latinos really have and can have. And so Luz Weinberg was very, very candid and very open about the fact that these changes to voter ID laws have been a huge challenge. Restrictions in early voting have been a huge challenge. Limits to third-party registration and the rules that have binded, limited, and completely truncated the efforts that organizations intended to have in registering new voters in states like Florida have been severely limited. And being able to educate those who serve NALEO as elected officials, being able to educate those who serve NALEO in partnership, as I mentioned, through Ya Es Hora, Univision, etc., and just having direct contact with people who are interested in voting and letting them know. I mean, something as simple as, every single time you move, you have to re-register to vote. If your driver's license has expired in a state that has a voter ID law, you're out. If you don't have a driver's license, if you don't have a state-issued ID, you have problems. If you're a student and you plan on voting in the state where you go to school, that's another issue. A number of states have restricted that. And I think it's amazing that, across 50 states, there are 50 different sets of laws and 50 different sets of rules that impact voters. And again, we always talk about how voting is a right. Voting is not a privilege. Voting is guaranteed constitutionally. There are a series of acts that were fought for with blood, sweat, and tears, like the Voting Rights Act, of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These things, there are no clearer examples of heroism and civic, civil rights and civic engagement than opening the path for Americans to vote. I mean, the fact is that there was an amendment to the Constitution of the United States to lower the voting age from 21 to 18. And despite all of those efforts, we continue to have a hodgepodge, a potpourri of election laws that are all over the place. And these variables in election laws and the severe differences in election laws are, you have same-day voter registration and opportunities to participate by simply showing up in states like Maine for a primary and Nevada for a caucus versus, Pennsylvania now having essentially eliminated the possibility that 800,000 or more of its residents are going to be able to vote because they're not going to be able to get a state-issued ID in time. So when you see states fighting with the Attorney General's Office of the United States of America in order to simply, again, protect voters' right to vote, which seems so basic and so simple and so intrinsic. It's like the right to free speech. And so, again, Luz Weinberg was very candid about the challenges that NALEO has had, about walking the fine line of, again, a lot of these states that have brought forth these restrictions have been, Republican-led states, and NALEO has Republican members and looks to represent and promote Republicans, and so that tension and those battles have to be treated diplomatically, have to be done well. But as she said, NALEO cannot ignore, the right to vote. You can't pretend as though voter ID laws haven't changed, early voting restrictions haven't been implemented, that vote by mail opportunities have evaporated, early voting, third-party voter registration, all of these changes are realities and facts, and Naleo needs to deal with them because they're so central to its core mission. So I really enjoyed the conversation that we had. When we finished talking about Naleo's work through Yarasoda and just in general through the mentorship program and where they're going and what the future holds, we had an interesting conversation about the island of Puerto Rico and the future of the island of Puerto Rico, and I was remarking about how many more people are for statehood today than were for statehood before. It was honestly, when they would have referendums about the future of the island, a third of people wanted to remain a commonwealth, a third wanted statehood, and a third wanted independence. And now that balance and that dynamic has changed, and I think that that's very interesting, and will continue to be part of this conversation about Latinos and the future of both parties, because I think, again, when we talk about Latinos and Hispanics, we're dealing with very different populations. Puerto Ricans have been citizens of the United States since 1917. Cuban Americans have a policy of immigration that once they reach U.S. soil, U.S. territory, they are safe and they are here. There are a number of people who came from the civil wars in Central America that still have a special status that was afforded them as refugees escaping violence, and there are those who want to end that status and modify that status because Central America is not involved in the same civil wars and conflicts that it was involved in the 1980s, and so there's different laws for different populations. I've spoken before about how Mexico is. People talk about Mexicans being the largest source of immigration from the Latino community, but it's the least advantageous in terms of rules. There are no advantages for education. There are no advantages for special skills. There's no advantages through family reunification, as family reunification can take up to 23 years. Mexico is excluded from the visa lottery. All the countries in Europe are included. Many of the countries of Asia and Africa are included. But countries that have historically had high immigration rates, like the Philippines and Mexico, are excluded from the visa lottery. So you're talking about a very strange world, a very series of policies, and that's not even bringing in the policies and the politics that deal with Dreamers and Obama's new deferred action policy. So there's so many rules, so many things, so many changes, so many sliding scales, and knowing that there's an Aleo there, knowing that Luz Weinberg is an advocate for an organization that seeks to improve the presence and the power of diverse voices, I think will help us to address issues that are long outstanding, like the fact that we have different immigration policies for different countries that are based on sliding scales and things that evolve and change over time. So with that said, thank you to Luz Weinberg and thank you to Naleo for affording us that interview as part of Politic365 Voice Your Vote, from the road to the Republican National Convention in Tampa, Florida, and the road to the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte, North Carolina. Thanks.